you like sci-fi, fantasy, action, adventure, and comic books? Then you've come to the right place for your weekly dose of anything and everything geek. So strap in and let's get this show on the road. Welcome to the Science Fictionary podcast. Welcome back to the Science Fictionary podcast presented by thesciencefictionary.com. I'm Andrew, and I'm here tonight with Marisha.
Hey, everybody.
And David.
Hello.
And we are going to wrap up. Well, I say wrap up. We're going to do our final part of the Pillars of Fantasy, and we'll go ahead and talk about this. Last time when we did the Pillars of Sci-Fi, in order to kind of round out our list and make sure we didn't miss critical things.
Which we did.
Which we, of course, did, because just the parameters of this mean you're not going to get everything. But in order to kind of squeeze in an extra list, we asked our listeners to tell us what we missed and tell us what they thought should have been on our list. And we want to do the same thing this week. If you've listened to the Pillars of Fantasy and you think that we missed anything in either the literature, TV, or movie category, or if there's just something else that would fit more in the miscellaneous list, and you'll kind of get a feel through this episode of what we're kind of putting on the miscellaneous list. Be sure to send those to us. Either send them to us on Twitter. Backyard TARDIS is already actually sending us stuff, and I'm sure he'll round out his list for next week. And we want some of you other guys to send us the things that belong on the list that we missed. And next week, we will do an episode where we will fill in that listener's list before we publish our final poster for the Pillars of Fantasy. So this week, we're going to get into the miscellaneous category, which is just kind of our catch-all for the things that don't quite fit in those other categories, or even possibly something that maybe we thought of from one of those other categories that we kind of thought of in the meantime. But mostly it's for those things that don't work in the other category. I know the last time we had things for science fiction, we had things like the inventions of Leonardo da Vinci, the sound design of Ben Burt, the music of John Williams. So those kinds of things is what we're really looking for in the miscellaneous category. So we're going to just jump right into the category tonight, and I'll go to David first. David, what's your first offering on the list?
Awesome. So I've been excited about this one because when we started doing fantasy, the first things I thought of are actually miscellaneous, because there's so much of that kind of stuff. And I'm a huge video game person. I love video games with all my heart. It's one of the biggest things in my life, so I wanted to put a video game because there are a ton of fantasy video games, and there are a ton that I considered for this list. I considered The Witcher, but we did include that on our literature, so that can go over there. The Witcher 3 is a big deal, but probably not the perfect answer for the video games. Legend of Zelda was highly considered. Obviously another fan favorite. Huge fantasy world, very beloved, but I'm not the personal biggest fan of Legend of Zelda, so I'm going to leave that off. I even thought about Mario, very fantasy, and obviously very big. And then the other one was World of Warcraft that I thought about. That's not my answer, but World of Warcraft I almost put on here. Obviously, has been around for years now. Still has thousands of players every month. Huge fantasy world. Probably the ultimate fantasy experience for a gamer is to play World of Warcraft. But what I finally settled on, there's a little bit of bias here, is the Elder Scrolls series by Bethesda. This includes games. There's been 5 Elder Scrolls games and more to come. And the biggest one of them all is Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, which everybody's heard of. It's one of the biggest games of all time. And I was literally playing it today. So there's a bit of bias picking the Elder Scrolls. But I picked the Elder Scrolls because it's out of all the fantasy worlds and video games, and honestly, in general, the Elder Scrolls is one of the most fleshed out, in-depth worlds that I've ever seen. In Skyrim, there are literally hundreds of in-game books that you can pick up and read in the game just about
Wow.
all the history and lore in this world. Obviously, it's very inspired by Tolkien. You have all the classic races like orcs, elves, humans, etc. But then they're their own that they've invented themselves that each have their own history. Every country in Tamriel has its own history and lore, and every race super fleshed out timelines and characters and bloodlines. It's very Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings all at the same time. And from my personal experience talking to people like at school around my age, a lot of what they know about fantasy actually comes from playing the Elder Scrolls games. Because yeah, you can watch Lord of the Rings and you can get knowledge, but when you're playing a game like the Elder Scrolls
Yep.
and you're playing it for countless hours, way more than you would be to watch a movie, you can play Skyrim for hundreds and hundreds of hours and still not see everything. You're meeting all these different races, you're talking to them, you're learning a lot about them, you're learning about not just races and stuff in the Elder Scrolls, but in general of what they are in fantasy.
Right.
And because of that such deep conversation you can have, I mean, you can walk up to an elf and talk to an elf about elvish culture in this game, and just because of that and how big Skyrim is and how many people know about it, I
Yep.
decided to pick that as my video game entry. So I have The Elder Scrolls by Bethesda.
Awesome.
That's a great choice. And I've got some video games that I've kind of given thought to as well. So that's definitely a big one.
Well, do you want to go next?
Awesome.
No,
Oh,
you go
also
ahead.
the music of Jeremy Soule. The music of Jeremy Soule in these games is one of my favorite fantasy works, right behind Howard Shore. If you haven't listened to Jeremy Soule's music, it is peak fantasy sound.
That's cool.
Awesome. All right. So, Andrew and I were talking. He's like, "Yeah." He says, "You're not allowed to steal any of my stuff. I worked a long time on that list," and I sat down. But my background is a little different than Andrew. Like my growing up, I was into very different things than he was, and just so happens that the things that I was in lend themselves very, very well to this category. So I'm going to start with, in no particular order. I'm going to start with the ballets of Tchaikovsky. Now he was actually a composer, not wasn't a choreographer or anything, but he wrote the music for some of the most famous ballets ever. He wrote the music for Swan Lake, Sleeping Beauty, The Nutcracker. Basically, he wrote the things that when people think about ballet music, this is what they think about. And the thing is that these stories have become a really important part of the cultural lexicon, especially for your particular kind of nerds like me. But of course, everybody knows the Nutcracker, right? The talking, well, I guess not talking in the ballet, but the soldiers that come to life and the mice and the war and all the dances of all the fairies and all the sweets from all over the world coming in. And so that's a really visible, obviously. Every Christmas, it seems like 3/4 of the ballet academies in the country stage some version or other of the Nutcracker. And it's become, like I said, it's become an important kind of cultural part of the cultural lexicon. It's something that, kind of gets referenced, people are familiar with. And it's actually, I was kind of looking, and, we talked about how fantasy really wasn't taken seriously, in television and in film for a really long time. It really just was one of those things that people sort of considered it to be for children. But the exception to that was ballet and opera. In the realm of the fine arts, like especially ballet and opera, fantasy is kind of a mainstay. Pretty much all of your most famous ballets and many of your most famous operas feature, some sort of fantasy element. Swan Lake, right, is about a cursed princess who turns into a swan and, has to get the prince to fall in love with her. But then there's the evil, the sorcerer and the the evil doppelganger, and all of some of your most classic fantasy tropes, and of course also the version of Sleeping Beauty that is most familiar to most people, which is the Disney version of Sleeping Beauty, was actually taken directly from the ballet, the Sleeping Beauty ballet. The music, in fact, is all taken directly from it, which is one of the reasons the movie didn't do smashingly well, because everybody thought it was weird the way that he used the existent music with the kind of edgy animation style. But so anyway, that's my first contribution to the category, is the music of Tchaikovsky, specifically that he wrote for ballet.
Okay.
I like it.
Good deal. All right. Well, let's see. I got to decide which one of these I want to throw up there first. I think the one that I'm going to take first, I'm going to go ahead and grab it before someone else does, if anyone else even considered it. But it's one of my favorite entries on my list. It's part of nearly everyone's childhood these days is The Muppets. And I'm choosing The Muppets. Like in science fiction, we talked about the Creature Shop in particular. And the Creature Shop has played a big role in fantasy and science fiction. And that is certainly a big part of it. The Muppets came about in 1955, created by Jim and Jane Henson, which she wasn't a Henson at the time. They created this. They got married 4 years later. But a show called Sam and Friends is the original. That's the origin of the Muppets. And the Muppets themselves, we talk about all the things that they've done. They've done things that were specifically, I mean, you talk about all the things they've done, like Wizard of Oz, using the Muppets and all these other things. But the Muppets themselves, because the way we've done them, the way that Jim Henson presented them, as there's these puppets, but we invite them into our real world. And we pretend like we do these shows where it's the Muppets and they're real people, guests. And so we invite them.
And you're supposed to take it seriously.
And you're supposed, and so you're taking these fantasy creatures and placing them alongside real people and inviting that fantastical element into our own world. But in addition to that, things that the Creature Shop specifically has been involved with in the fantasy realm, the Dark Crystal, Labyrinth, Star Wars, The Never-Ending Story 2, just to name a handful of really important pieces of fantasy. And just
That
because
is awesome. I 100% agree.
Yeah, so just because of all that, the Muppets are my first entry into the category.
That's great.
So it brings us back
I love
around
the Muppets.
to David.
Everybody loves the Muppets. I got cabin fever.
Everybody loves the Muppets. So my next entry, I'm gonna go with. This is a bit vague, but I thought it was important enough to include, and I hope y'all agree. I went with mythology, mainly Roman, Greek, Norse, and Chinese, Hindu, and Japanese mythology. I didn't know really how to narrow that down. I tried thinking about it, but I couldn't, and all I could think was I don't know how to I don't know how to specify like a single book that describes all the Roman gods and all the Greek gods and all the Norse gods. So I kind of I thought mythology would kind of fit this category.
Yeah.
And just saying like mythology, including those. Obviously, and we've mentioned, especially in the literature section, stuff like the Odyssey and the Epic of Gilgamesh, which all kind of are influenced by that, by like Roman and Greek mythologies, I believe, right? And Beowulf, very Norse mythology. But even there's so much even outside of those,
right,
that is so important and such a big deal that I thought I should include it here. All of the different gods and the legends and the stories. It's some of the most timeless storytelling in existence, the kind of stuff that everybody knows. You learn about it in school. This is where you're learning about fantasy in school. I remember learning about all these mythologies in like sixth grade and thinking to myself, like, I'm just learning about like Lord of the Rings right now.
Right.
You might as well, be teaching me this kind of stuff. Um, Obviously, has a huge influence on everything. I mean, Thor is literally in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and he
Right.
comes
Right.
from Norse mythology. Everybody knows about Zeus, and Zeus is the father of Wonder Woman, another superhero. You have Hercules that comes
Right.
from that, and which of course you have the movie. You have all these legends and archetypes. That's the big one. Is all the archetypes that are created by these mythologies
Right.
and the storytelling and the legend that is constantly mirrored in modern storytelling, especially fantasy storytelling. And I didn't know how else to narrow it down. And if I'm not thinking of something that y'all are, please
I don't
jump in.
I don't
Just
no,
mythology.
you're right, and I'm entering it here as ancient world mythologies.
Perfect.
Because
Perfect.
it's not fair to narrow it down to one.
Yep.
Exactly.
Because they've
I
all
had Greek
played.
mythology, and
Yeah,
I just kept
I
going.
started off trying to write them all down, and I finally just went, no, it's ancient world mythologies. The Aztec mythologies are currently playing roles in things that are being developed. Mayan mythologies, the Japanese and Chinese mythologies are extraordinarily important. Egyptian mythologies, they're
Yeah.
they're all very important. And I as we talked about before, the and we kind of talked about this with sci-fi was the religions that have some of these sci-fi elements. They also have some of these fantastical elements, and these ancient mythologies have, because of what fantasy is, because fantasy is the root form of all storytelling. It starts with these. These are the earliest
Yeah.
stories told.
I mean, like, there's no pretending like you couldn't take the first 11 chapters of Genesis and make one heck of a one heck of a sci-fi or a fantasy, world out of just that bizarreness up in there, with the monsters.
So yeah, that's a fantastic entry. They have forever altered and influenced and will continue to influence fantasy writing forever because they're the root of fantasy storytelling. It was
Absolutely.
these mythologies, these oral traditions.
Well, and that's the thing. It's the stories that people sit around and tell each other. Those are ultimately the ones that are the most compelling. Is the stories that people don't tell because they had to read the book in school, but the stories that people tell because it resonates with who we are as human beings.
Right.
And that's
Right.
what mythology is.
Well, and that's the thing is we have versions of these that were written down much later in print, and written down and then printed much later.
Right.
But they predate that. These are oral traditions.
Yeah.
These are the oral traditions of cultures all over the world that inspired people to tell stories.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, on that same, is it my turn now?
It's your turn, yeah.
All right. So on the note of ancient mythologies, one of the things that was sort of part of the revival of interest in defunct religions and obscure mythologies at the time was Wagner, of course, famously the Ring Cycle, right? The story of the divine child who doesn't know that he's divine, so he goes on a quest and he gets a sword from a dwarf who's evil, and he goes and he finds a princess who's on a mountaintop ringed with fire, and he just like this whole affair, and the world is born and the world dies and it's reborn again, and it's this cycle. And this is some of the most, some of the greatest music ever written was written by Wagner for the Ring Cycle. Now, Wagner, he was one son of a gun. He was not a nice person, but man, if that man could not write some phenomenal music. The Ride of the Valkyries is probably the most famous example. I mean, pretty much that has been used in.
It's right.
Yes,
and that's the thing about the ring cycle is nearly everyone knows these pieces of music, whether they know that this is where they came from or not.
Yeah.
And they're centered around.
That's awesome.
It's Wagner's through opera, the retelling of Norse mythology.
And it was definitely part of that nationalistic, like, oh, we Germans are actually Norse and this is our thing. It was definitely part of that movement. But I mean, I don't know how accurate he got the Norse mythology stories, but he sure enough told it in a super compelling way. And the Ring Cycle is still like maybe the most performed opera. I mean, because it's 3, but whenever you put them all together, I think it may be the most performed opera ever.
It's still certainly one of them.
It's been ridiculously popular. But yeah, the Ride of the Valkyries. Thank you, Wagner. And Greek mythology. No, Norse mythology.
I didn't know that.
Yes.
That's dope.
Yeah.
My
Opera is way
favorite
cooler than
wrestler's
people
theme
give
song.
it. Yes. Opera is way cooler than people give it credit for.
Opera's dope, bro.
Yeah.
I jam to the Phantom of the Opera.
Well, it's such an interesting way to tell stories.
Oh, it's a very Greek way to tell stories.
Correct. Yeah.
It's basically, that's what it basically is kind of drawing in those. It was part of the Renaissance, was like, hey, let's resurrect how we think that they used to tell stories. But anyway, I think it's Andrew's turn next.
Okay. So my next entry is going to be one that I'm relatively certain no one else pulled.
Okay.
But it's Weird Tales magazine.
I did not pull that.
In the spirit of the same thing I did with pulling a magazine for the Pillars of Sci-Fi, this one, it's kind of a fantasy pulp magazine. It was started in 1922. It is... So these magazines in the 20s and 30s were some of the first places that many of these science fiction and fantasy stories were first given a place to be published. Before bookmakers were really wanting to publish a lot of these stories. And you got to remember, this is pre-trade paperback. Like,
Right.
these publishers aren't wanting to sink lots of money into these hardback books that they're not going to sell. They're not doing these mass market paperbacks yet. So everything's hardbound or leather bound. So these magazines are the place where a lot of these things get their start. Weird Tales, it's the first place we ever saw Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythology. Which, whatever you think about Lovecraft, the Cthulhu mythology has been lasting and has affected tons of stuff over time, including things like Dungeons and Dragons and lots of other stuff. It's where a lot of Robert E. Howard's Conan stories first appeared as well.
Interesting.
So I think when you're talking, like we talked about in the science fiction category, these pulps, these magazines were really where fandom began to develop as a big, important thing. And Weird Tales magazine was probably the most important magazine publishing fantasy and fantasy horror stories out there.
Interesting.
So because of that, Weird Tales is my
Awesome.
my second entry.
Great.
Awesome.
All right, that brings us back around to David.
So, you actually just mentioned it, and so I was actually going to save this till last, but I'm going to go ahead and bring it up since you just mentioned it. My next entry, which is kind of similar in a way to the mythologies, but I thought deserved one on its own and fit on its own, is Lovecraft mythos. The works of H.P. Lovecraft as a whole. There are some incredible specific books you should read. I suggest there's one that I read. I believe it's just called The Works of H.P. Lovecraft. It's like something as simple. That is a huge like tome of a book
Yep.
that you have to read. It's basically like a coffee table book, but the works of H.P. Lovecraft are some of the most, like you just mentioned, important pieces of fantasy to things like Dungeons and Dragons, and things like the Elder Scrolls, like I mentioned earlier. Um, it's kind of this weird niche thing that's always there. Like it's almost like Cthulhu's always there, hovering in the fantasy conversation,
Mm-hmm.
especially when talking about like fantasy villains and terrifying things, and the
Mm-hmm.
ideas that H.P. Lovecraft put forward still blow my mind, and I love to read about them. The very idea that like these things that are so terrifying that your brain can't even comprehend it, so it just like explodes. And like what you see as Cthulhu, the octopus man, that's not what Cthulhu looks like. That's just the closest thing that your brain can possibly comprehend to what it is that he is. Just these incredible ideas that H.P. Lovecraft put out into the world. I believe he started publishing stories that fit into the Cthulhu mythos in the early 1920s,
Correct.
and they were kind of published all over the place, like you just said, in magazines and different books and stories that he put out. The like according to like the wiki, the official like fictional universe is just called the Cthulhu mythos.
Right.
And so that
And
is my next entry on the Pillars of Fantasy.
it's a really interesting one. It's Lovecraft in his lifetime. Nobody cared about his writings. It was something
Really?
that became big sometime after his death. It really is one of the first great modern mythologies. It's one of
That's
those
what I love
things.
about it, just the mythology.
It's that you had some, and that's the thing is like his writings. His stories themselves, they get real mixed reviews all the time. Like even people going back now and going, well, it's like some of it's okay and some of it's terrible, but the brilliance of it wasn't necessarily the stories he told, but
The world you put him in.
enormous this world that he put them in, the mythologies that he created around his story. That's what he was brilliant at.
Yeah.
And it's one of the
Exactly.
first great modern mythologies. And I would say that, we have because we're a young nation, the United States is a young nation, we have the 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 American mythology is the comic book, really. That the early superheroes,
I
the golden
agree.
era superheroes, that's the American mythology. But Lovecraft created this wonderful mythology that just has increasing. That's the thing about it. Nobody in his lifetime, he had very little success, but particularly the stuff that originated with the Call of Cthulhu has just continued to grow and grow and grow.
Yep.
To even the point where one of the biggest shows out there right now in Stranger Things is borrowing heavily from Lovecraft.
Great example of just like that's just straight up Lovecraft. All the creatures and the ideas, and I love it. It's incredible.
All right, Marish, that brings us back around to you again.
That brings back to me. All right. So the next thing on my list is something that I kind of didn't immediately think of when I thought fantasy, but the more I thought about it, the more I think it really fits, and that's Midsummer Night's Dream by William Shakespeare. And it's really different from modern fantasy because it takes place in a very medieval vision of a fantasy world, right? And let's not kid ourselves. The way that we think about elves and dwarves and river sprites is very, very different from the way that they thought about all of these things during the Renaissance. And Midsummer Night's Dream, of course, I mean, Shakespeare is, if you've never watched Shakespeare and only ever read it, then you're doing yourself a disservice. But Midsummer Night's Dream, I mean, some of the most classic, fantasy icons, from that aren't purely mythological. And that's the really interesting thing about Midsummer Night's Dream is it's actually really fantasy in the sense that it's not just retellings of a mythology or a fairy tale. This is honest to goodness somebody taking a lot of these elements and weaving their own fantastical story around them, which is, I mean, it's modern fantasy, and it was written in the 1600s. So that's pretty brilliant. So that's my selection as a Midsummer Night's Dream.
I like that because I thought about Shakespeare and stuff like that, and I probably haven't read nearly as much Shakespeare as you have, or know as much about it. But from what I have read, a lot of the stories are very, very, very close to being fantasy. In fact, some of them are just straight up fantasy. The Tempest,
Yep.
for example, a lot of Shakespeare's works like that. So I kind of like tried to see where I could fit that in. So, but I just didn't have room for it on my list. So I'm really, really glad you brought it up.
Yeah, The Tempest, as you're right, is another excellent example of Shakespeare does fantasy. Because like I said, it's interesting because it's not just a straight up like, and these are the fairy tales and these are the Greek gods. It's like, and this is me making up my own weird stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so my next entry, I guess this will be what, my third entry?
Yep, we're around 3.
Okay. For my third entry on the list, I'm going to choose Dungeons and Dragons.
Somebody had to do it. You stole David's thunder, love.
Well,
Go back to my list. See what I can change. No, please. Continue.
and no, I mean, I definitely want to hear what you have to say about it. But you're talking about, I cannot remember the name of the guy. There were two guys that created it. It's Gary Gygax and I can't remember the name of the other guys. But they literally created their own publishing company to put this game out, called Tactical Studies Rules Incorporated.
Which is like the lamest name for a publishing company ever.
Well, okay, so basically these types of games, before this, Dungeons and Dragons is not the first role-playing game, but prior to Dungeons and Dragons, they're mostly military games.
Right.
And so that's kind of where the whole tactical studies thing comes in there, is that's the kind of game they're toying with.
Like the miniatures place in Baton Rouge with like the little soldiers and stuff.
Right. So, this is the company, Gary Gygax and Dave Ameson created Dungeons and Dragons itself. I think it was Gary Gygax and somebody else who created the publishing company. But so 1974, you're talking about the RPG that it's essentially the board game, the tabletop game version of it did what Lord of the Rings did to books and then to movies for board games or for tabletop games. Because it's not a board game, but for tabletop gaming, it created this thing that dwarfs all the ones that came before it, and it's still the biggest today, even though it was created in 1974. Of course, it's now owned by and made by Wizards of the Coast, which is a Hasbro subsidiary. But I think what Dungeons and Dragons really brings to the table is it's, of course, based on everything fantasy. But what it has done is inspired millions of people to tell their own fantasy stories.
Yeah.
And not just to tell them, but to invest in them and share them with others and experience them with others. And so it gives,
that's the beauty of it.
It's not just reading or listening to or watching, it's fantasy immersion. And I think that's the beauty of Dungeons and Dragons. And I am curious to see what David had to say about it as well, since it was clearly on his list also.
Yeah, that's okay. I still got plenty more to fit in. But yeah, so Dungeons and Dragons, you pretty much said it. It is the like premier way to experience full immersion in fantasy. I love this game. I've been playing it once a week for about a year and a half now. I've always wanted to play it, but never got around to it. And finally, my friend wanted to. And you're right. It's allows people to create their own stories and then share them with their friends. And that's what my DM has done, and that's what I've now done as a DM myself. Is being able to write my own stories, my own fantasy stories, and include whatever races I want to include in the story, and whatever characters and archetypes I want to include and talk about. And then my players get to be whatever they want to be. I get to be whatever I want to be in a fantasy world. I can be a human ranger who lives in the woods and is secretly the heir to the throne of
Gondor.
Hondor instead of Gondor because I don't want to call it Gondor. Um, I didn't actually call it Hondor, but I did make a character like that. Or I could be a dwarf who's a bard who secretly wants to be a chef, but he's shunned by his fellow dwarves, so he learns to be a smith, but really he wants to be a chef. So instead, he creates the shop. He moves away and creates a shop called the Hammer and Spoon, where he's a smith and he's a chef, and all these these crazy things that anything you can think of in a fantasy world, you now get to fully experience it with Dungeons and Dragons. And there are other fantasy role playing games now, but Dungeons and Dragons has still stayed on top since 1974. It's still the premier way to go. It's so accessible now. The fifth edition is great. I've played a couple different editions now. The fifth edition is still my favorite. It's the most accessible, but it's not dumbed down. I mean, relatively speaking, it is, but it's not dumb. Really fun to play. Check out D&D Beyond to quickly be able to get into it. You can learn a lot about fantasy, learn a lot about different creatures and species and archetypes and environments and things like that by playing Dungeons and Dragons, and it just completely opens your entire fantasy world to a whole new realm of possibility.
Yeah. We haven't actually played D&D, but it's definitely one of those things that you can't be a nerd and not at least have some basic understanding of what D&D is and what it does. And of course, you couldn't be a super conservative kid in the 90s without understanding that Dungeons and Dragons was evil.
It's very
So
evil.
problematic.
Very,
Who
very.
was it that was talking about? We had a friend who was talking about, yeah, you had to watch out for D&D. There's a Adventures in Odyssey episode about how the dangers of LARPing, how it might get you into LARPing. Yep. Hello, everyone. I was that person.
But yeah, that was one that this list couldn't be made without putting Dungeons and Dragons on it. It's
Absolutely.
too crucial, and it's a big part of what this list is really about, is the things that have inspired people to create, and Dungeons and Dragons has played an enormous role in that. David, that brings us back around to you for your fourth entry.
Okay, so this one's, kind of difficult because there are a couple different things that I kind of just want to get mentioned, but I decided to settle on this, and it's kind of like the safe way to go, but it's deserving. Um, Even though we already have talked about the Lord of the Rings more than anything else in this Pillars list, I'm still going to include the works of Howard Shore on the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Um, it is music, and even like I said, even though we talked about this while talking about the movies, it's still so important in and of itself
Yeah.
that I thought it belonged here. That music, it is 100% everything I think of when I think of fantasy sound.
Yeah.
I love the music. It's on my playlist. It's what plays when I play D&D. Um, and I already mentioned Jeremy Soule earlier, and I love Jeremy Soule, but nothing beats Howard Shore's fantastical works. Um, I love the themes and having a theme for each piece of the movie, like each character, like group of characters, has a theme. The Ring has a theme. Gondor has a theme. Rohan has a theme. You know, like all these different themes that play at these very specific moments. It's all beautifully crafted and just adds so much to the experience. And I didn't know if I wanted to include them because there's other things I could include. And we'd already talked about Lord of the Rings, but when we did the Pillars of Sci-Fi, I mentioned um, oh my God, John Howard, right? That's his name.
Uh,
No, it's not.
Howard Shore.
How? No, Howard Shore just now. But who did Star Wars?
Oh, John Williams.
John Will. Oh my God, I'm ashamed of myself. I was thinking John. I had Howard Shore in my head, and then
Uh-huh.
John Williams. So I said John Howard. John Williams. I mentioned John Williams in the miscellaneous list, so I wanted to do the same honors to Howard Shore here.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's
When talking about music and his work on the Lord of the Rings, that
Yes.
it is the benchmark. It is the thing to beat when making fantasy music.
I agree, and it's again a testament to just Lord of the Rings in general. You're literally you can't overstate it. It's simply one of the greatest stories ever written.
Yeah. And they
agree.
hit all the nails squarely on the head, including the music. I mean, the leitmotif hadn't been used quite so well, which is the like the little memorable da 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 da. Right, that's your Hobbit moment. You have your Ring theme. Those little themes, they're called leitmotifs. It was one of Wagner's big things, and I mean, not since Star Wars had it been used so well, and it's so perfectly that style of music is so perfectly what's the word I'm looking for? Not adapted. It fits this style of story so well, that fantasy and the huge sweeping scope.
Yeah, it adds this epicness because it becomes part of the story. It's not just music that's there in the background; it tells you what's going on. It's a lot like the
Yeah.
music in an opera.
You
It tells you what's happening.
It's exactly like the music in an
Exactly.
opera. That's exactly what it is.
Right.
It's
in the
opera
same way
music.
that the Phantom of the Opera song plays whenever the Phantom of the Opera shows up. That's what's happening when Frodo pulls out the ring, or when Gollum climbs over a rock, or you see Mordor.
Yeah.
That's exactly it, and it's wonderful. I recently, because we were talking so much about it, I recently bought on Audible. Actually, I got it for free. I got a dramatized reading of the Fellowship of the Ring,
Oh
and
yes.
it's wonderful. I think Ian Holm is actually one of the voices. It's a great cast, and I've been listening to it and loving it at work and stuff. But it's really missing something. Like, I can actively notice that it's missing something. These story beats, without having that wonderful music playing behind it that I'm just so used to now. They talk about, they say, oh, Frodo or like Bilbo is fingering the ring in his pocket, and I want to hear the theme that plays when the ring is mentioned.
Yeah.
So yeah, 100%. Some of my favorite music ever. Like I said, I don't just listen to it when I play Dungeons and Dragons. I listen to it going down the street when I'm just relaxing. I love having just the Shire theme playing.
Yes. I love me some
I
Hobbit
have a
music.
mod. We talk about exactly. I have a mod in my Skyrim game that replaces. Doesn't replace. It adds on top of Jeremy Soul's incredible music. Adds all of the Lord of the Rings music
That's
into
great.
the game. The play while I'm playing.
Uh-huh.
Wonderful, wonderful sounds.
That's awesome. Yes, you're definitely right. That one definitely deserves a spot. All right, am I next?
You are next.
All right.
Yeah,
So
that's my 4. So
is
you're
this
your
it?
4.
This is the last one? All right. So I'm going to do everyone a favor and forego another relatively obscure opera in The Magic Flute, which is important, in case you're wondering, by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. And if this were a classical music podcast, I would talk about it at great length. But I already talked about Wagner and Tchaikovsky, so I'm going to move on. And instead, I'm going to pull Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie. So it's been most memorable for people my age, right? As a Disney movie. It was a book. The book is great. However, the first iteration of this story was as a play. And in fact, if you've ever seen the movie Hook, you've seen little bits of it, with, she's is a kiss, and there the whole conversation about the kiss and all of that. That's actually taken from the play Peter Pan, written in 1902. And plays have a tendency to flop, whenever a lot of things are like, even I was reading about Swan Lake. Swan Lake was a total disaster and everyone hated it when it first premiered. But now it's one of the most iconic things ever. Well, Peter Pan was not that way. Peter Pan was a hit from the beginning, and it appealed to people's desire to hold on to their innocence and their childhood. It was the most childlike grown-up story you could tell about a little boy who never grows up and fights pirates. And it's managed to remain in much the same way The Wizard of Oz is something that's still constantly referenced just in everyday conversation. Peter Pan is another one that is just, he's a lost boy, oh, all right, well, go back to Neverland. It's one of those things that just is such an important part of how we as Americans talk about life. I think it would be, we would be remiss to leave it off this list. So there we go. J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan.
Yep, that's another great addition.
Oh, and not to mention, this was the first time that they actually used wires to make actors fly. It was like people were like, "Oh, what is this witchcraft?" Like it had never occurred to anybody that you could actually have actors zipping around the stage looking like they were flying. But they did it.
All right. So for my fourth choice, I'm going to choose one that's actually already been mentioned tonight, way back during the first choice, when David chose the Elder Scrolls. He mentioned one that I just can't make this list and not include it, and that is The Legend of Zelda.
Ooh, I didn't know if you were going to say World of Warcraft or that.
World of Warcraft is another one that's it's kind of hard to leave off this list. It's not one I've played much, but The Legend of Zelda goes all the way back to 1986. It has had 24 sequels or spin-off games
that
made.
Is unreal.
It has another one, a 25th, in development right now.
A video game that came out the year I was born.
It was the brainchild of one of the greatest video game designers of all time, and Miyamoto, who made all of the great games from the golden age of the Nintendo. He based the story on these explorations of his when he was a child in Japan, and would explore these woods and caves and all of these things. He based the Link, his main character, and the fairy companion are based on Peter Pan and Tinkerbell.
Oh, perfect.
The Master Sword is based on Excalibur.
Yep.
So it's all of these elements that when we talk about this, we talk about the scope of this story that's been being told, even though there is apparently a little bit of confusion exactly what the timeline of the Zelda stories is.
Confusion's an understatement.
It is a wonderful world that has been created and continues to evolve. And again, within video games, is one of the greatest fantasy worlds that's ever been created. And for those reasons, and just because of just the sheer number of people who've played these games, and for many was some of their earliest introduction to the fantasy genre, other than nursery rhymes and fairy tales, it is. It was just too important to me to that I could not leave this one off the list. So I'm
Well, I'm
putting,
happy that you brought it up.
yeah. So the
I'm happy that
legend,
you did include it after I brought it up.
yeah. So Legend of Zelda, and that's the thing. When you're making your, if you're going to contribute to our listeners list for next week, if we mentioned it and didn't include it, and
It's
you
fair
still want
game.
it on there, it's still fair game because oftentimes we may mention something else because we had to make a hard choice between three or four different things in order to, because we didn't want these lists to just be 50 items long, so we
Right.
restricted ourselves to kind of four or five choices as what these lists have really worked out to. And oftentimes we had to leave things off that we know were important in order to squeeze them on here. And oftentimes that's why we name those other things when we're telling you which one we chose, because we know they're important. So please don't hesitate to grab those for your listeners list if you think they belong there. But that wraps us up to 12. Now, my list for this wasn't quite as extensive as some of the other lists we've done, but I do want to give everybody a chance. We're at 12 items because we had very little overlap in our list, which was probably the least overlap we've had. Although I
Yeah.
think the miscellaneous category was kind of that way last time, where there
Yeah.
wasn't a tremendous amount of overlap.
There's a couple of things like everybody at least thought D&D.
Yeah. I mean, we all kind of thought about the same things, but ultimately we mostly chose different things, and it's a wonderful list. But I do want to give everybody a chance. If you've got one more thing that you really want to throw out there for consideration, this is your chance.
So, real quick, I'll just say that also speaking of Legend of Zelda, the music in the Legend of Zelda is
Oh yeah,
iconic and some of the best fantasy music ever produced. I love the music in Legend of Zelda. But as for one more thing, I have one that I thought about this after we did our movies category, and really it kind of fits in the movies, but also can fit here. You'll understand what I mean when I say it. And if y'all think it should go in the movie category, maybe we could retroactively add it there, or we could put it here. But I was ashamed that I didn't think of Fantasia when talking about the movie category. Um, the Mickey Mouse and the blue hat wizard.
Yeah.
It's kind of a musical, kind of a you know hodgepodge of like
yeah.
just cool looking animation. Like, is it a short? Is it? It's not a
Well,
short. It's 2 hours, but is it a?
It's a series of
What is it?
shorts almost.
It is, but it's also
Right, exactly.
the fact that they do. I mean, you can include this here because I mean, I honestly think that you could say Fantasia, and you could say that you're talking specifically about the nightly event at
Disney World.
Disney, because that in itself
was about
is
to mention,
just
yeah.
incredible.
Yeah.
It is, and that's actually now that I think about it, Disney World in general probably could be on the list. Just
Oh.
Disney World.
That's an excellent point. I think that
Yeah,
that-
at least Magic Kingdom, Disney's Magic Kingdom.
Magic King, yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Well, but what about Hollywood Studios is where they do. I mean, they've got Pandora in
That's true.
Animal Kingdom now. They've got Star Wars in Hollywood Studios.
That's true.
So I think we just might have to say Disney parks.
I would not be complaining. Yeah, now that I mention it, because I was gonna mention with Fantasia, also the light show at Disney Magic Kingdom is breathtaking,
Yes.
and it's something that like everybody should. Obviously, not everyone can go to Disney World, but watch it on YouTube
Yeah.
at the least, man, because it's
Yeah.
wonderful.
Drive over
I remember being
to-
like an 8-year-old kid.
Yep.
I remember being like an 8-year-old kid in Disney and being like, I don't want to watch a stupid magic. I want to keep riding rides. But then my dad was like, just shut up and watch the show, please. And I loved it. Because he knew that I would, because he knows that that's something I would actually enjoy if I just watched
Yeah.
it. But with that in mind, Disney World kind of encapsulates that. Like, that is part of Magic Kingdom. So I'm happy I brought it up because it led me to that train of thought. Disney World.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I will probably do is, if you're cool with it, because I think Fantasia belongs on the list, and we can still list it separately because of its multiple, different iterations, and I may do that. But I'm also going to put Disney World / Land or Disney Parks on here, and I'm going to mention some of the specific things that fall under that, because I'm glad somebody thought to say that before we wrapped up here.
Absolutely.
Because, it's this place where you can go and you can experience all of these wonderful fantasy
It's the
stories.
most magical place on earth. It just is.
So, that's great. But I think that Fantasia in itself, because of the music, the combination of all the things that make it what it is, that I think it belongs on the list as well. It's separately.
Yeah.
So that's a great entry. Marisha, did you have anything else that you really wanted to throw out
The
there?
only other thing I had was the magic flute, but it's like I said, I'm tired of talking about opera.
All right, so since that puts us, I've got one. It's kind of a weird one, and if y'all reject it, my feelings will not be hurt.
Okay.
But I'm going to throw it out there because the more I think about it, the more I at least want to talk about it. Is the music of Led Zeppelin.
Ah.
I love that
Specifically, five pieces of five different musical pieces. Kashmir, which is about is about India and about these wise men living in the mountains, these mystics and things like that. Immigrant Song, which is about Norse mythology. Achilles' Last Stand. Right. Achilles' Last Stand, which, of course, Greek mythology.
Yeah.
Ramble On, which is actually a kind of strange version of Lord of the Rings. And the Battle of Evermore, which is this wild combination of Arthurian and Tolkien stories.
It's pretty much like D&D. It's like before there was Dungeons and Dragons, it's like they made a song about it.
Because if what we're talking about is these things that pushed fantasy into the pop culture limelight, the music of Led Zeppelin, at least this part of the catalog.
Dude, Immigrant Song is in Thor Ragnarok.
Oh yeah.
I think I was not laughing at you to make I was laughing because out of all the things I expected you to say, I would not have guessed that in a million years. But as soon as you said it, I absolutely loved it. And I love that idea as an entry on the list and 100% agree. And now that you mention it, hell yes.
Yeah.
Put that on the list.
I'm with you. If it weren't for Led Zeppelin, Elijah never would have brushed his teeth for like 2 years. That's how. So we realized at some point we'd be like, "Hey, y'all go brush your teeth." So we realized what they were doing is the kids are going in there, and Iana, which is the oldest girl, she would be like, "All right, buddy, sing the Thor Ragnarok song," and so he'd be in there going, "Ah," and while she was brushing his teeth, because she's like, "That's the only way I can get him to keep his mouth open."
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
And he still walks around and sings it.
He does, yeah. Yeah.
Of course, he also sings the
do
Liberty
too.
Mutual song. So.
Yeah. Liberty, 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 liberty.
Liberty.
And he also, he was bouncing around the house the other day going, Limu, Emu, and Doug. He's really into Liberty Mutual commercials.
Aren't we all?
All right, guys. Well, I think that's going to wrap us up for the Pillars of Fantasy, and I can't wait to see what our listeners come up with for next week's list. And so we'll get into that, and then as soon as we get that put up, we will we'll get that poster up. We'll add that final poster. If you haven't seen it, you can go to our TeePublic page, and we have a poster there, full size. It can be bought small, but it's a full size poster of our Pillars of Science Fiction, and we do plan to follow that up with one for the Pillars of Fantasy.
Yeah. You know, we could cut it in half
definitely
and put it on that
not-
door right there. So when it's closed, it would be there. Andrew's walls are like covered in stuff. So like finding a place for anything new is always a challenge.
I'm sure you've already done this, Andrew. I finally had the bright idea after buying so much art that one day I was at WizCon, I had all this art, and I realized I have nowhere to hang this up. So I bought a giant portfolio folder that people would use for like their own art, and I just started keeping artwork in there.
Yeah,
that I have.
Yeah, we've
and like
got,
I keep it like out on my desk, so like when people come over, I'm like, yeah, come take a look at my collection.
Yeah, that's a good plan.
what I really
feel special.
want is like a modular picture frame where they kind of stack, where you could just change the one that's on front every once in a while. I don't know how that would work, but some sort of mounting system where you can just change the piece that's on the front so you can see different
Yeah, that could be.
things, but then they're all hanging there on the wall, so you're not like, where am I going to put this while it's
Right.
not on the wall?
Yeah.
I have threatened to start putting them on the ceiling, but I just, like, when I was a kid, I had a big, giant model Millennium Falcon that me and my dad built that hung above my bed. And one night it crashed and burned right on my face. So I do sort of have a fear of hanging things on the ceiling.
That's too much.
But
Yeah, I had a Pulp Fiction poster right above my head, not on the ceiling but on the wall. And one day it fell over, and I basically kissed Uma Thurman because it just fell right on my face.
That's hilarious.
all right, guys. Well, that's
So
gonna.
I totally understand. Sorry,
No, it's fine.
I think it's a good place to wrap up.
All right, guys. Well, that's going to wrap us up for this episode of the Science Fictionary podcast. Until next week, Marisha, where can people find you?
You can find me on my website, princessesandpadawans.com. You can find me on Instagram at princesses_and_padawans, and on Twitter my Twitter handle is ppadawans. Yes.
All right, David, where can people find you?
I can be found on both Twitter and Instagram at stay_creativedd and on my YouTube page at Creative D&D.
All right, I'm Andrew Gore. You can find me running the Twitter account for this show at sci_fictionary. You can find me hosting our other show, Coruscant Radio Underground. We talk about all the things we love about that galaxy far, far away. You can find us at thesciencefictionary.com, or you can drop us a line at thesciencefictionary@gmail.com. You can also find us, as well as the rest of the Red 5 podcast family, at red5network.com or at Red5 Network on Twitter. And you should definitely go over there and check out all of the wonderful podcasts there. And until next time, may the Force be with you.